A very good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed for joining us for this session, which is entitled Beyond Restructuring, How to Build an Equitable Architecture for African Debt. Now, to state the obvious, debt's becoming an increasingly large challenge for much of Africa. Many factors are at play: rising cost of energy and food imports, falling prices for raw materials, wars, climate change, and poor governance have all played their part in this situation. And what's more, the debt restructuring challenges that we've seen over the past years in countries such as Zambia and in Ghana in particular have actually emphasized the need for a new kind of approach to restructuring with the sort of different complicated situation emerging in terms of creditors and overlapping claims. So obviously there needs to be a new approach and a fresh start, as it were. Excuse me. Let's see. In this session, we're going to talk about what lessons can be learned from these restructuring processes that we've just seen in the last few years. We're also going to just look at the sheer size and the sheer scale of the challenge as well. We have a very kind of distinguished panel who are going to be joining us today. My name is John Everington. I am the Middle East and Africa editor for The Banker magazine, which is part of the Financial Times in London. To set the scene for us, first of all, we're going to have a presentation. We're going to have a presentation from Mr. Charles de BOISRIOU, who is a partner and member of the African board for Forvis Mazars in France. And so, Charles, can I invite you to come up to the stage to give your presentation to set the scene for us, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, dear panelists, thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce this session on a subject which is complex, and I will therefore approach it with seriousness and humility. First, by discussing what has changed in the African debt over the last few years, and then opening avenues that may be further explored by our panelists. First, high and evolving debt. High debt rising and service increasingly weighting in African economies. Maybe some facts would lead us to qualify or weight the magnitude of the problem. Because compared with the total amount of global debt, public and private, in the world, the region's debt overhang seems manageable, and because caution is still required when referring to figures on indebtedness of African states due to the weight of the informal economy. But at the end of the day, the debt crisis is back on the table with a continued deterioration in the interest payment revenue ratio, which is a key parameter to assess countries' ability to service its debt. And this ratio has more than doubled since the 2010s. The debt is not only significant, but it has also changed its structure. On the one hand, the growing role of private sector over the past 15 years has profoundly changed the situation. The fall of interest rates in the 2010s has facilitated access to the international financial market for African countries and encourage investors looking to returns to turn to these states. And private financing was also an opportunity to circumvent, to overtake the conditions imposed by international financial institutions. And on the other hand, the weight of bilateral creditors has accordingly decreased, and its composition has changed. The statistics differs according to sources, but we still agree that the share of Paris Club donors has substantially decreased in the last years in favor of new players, notably China, which holds about 20% of Africa debts to the rest of the world. So in the face of this emergency, what are the options for giving fresh impetus to African economies? In doing so, I would like to ask the panelists the following questions. Because first, there is what is at the hands on the countries. So the questions are, how to increase tax revenues? Can asset collateralization be considered as an alternative? And how can we improve investors' perceptions of the quality of African countries' signatures? And I would like to stay a few moments, to pause a few moments on this last subject. It is true that the visual is not satisfactory. So would the big three be too harsh toward African countries? In relation to these questions, I'm not going to submit answers, but to propose elements of reflections. One, agencies dispute this assertion. Two, the business of rating is complex and existing agencies are not infallible. And it's recalled that some of them were substantially questioned during the subprime crisis. Three, there may be a difference between the appreciation of a country's economic potential and its ability to raise taxes. And four, if the African Union proposed African rating agency is to be established, it seems important that this new institution offers investors the same guarantees of independence and expertise as its competitors. But not everything is at the hands of countries, which puts us in front of difficulties in the functioning of multilateralism. The first area of reflections concerns debt restructuring mechanism. Although multilateralism institutions have taken initiative in recent years, the expansions and fragmentation of the credit base, as discussed earlier, complicates debt settlement by multilateral mechanism, which operates on proven principles like conditionality and comparability, which may not be more appropriate to the current situation. And there are certainly other avenues to explore, such as representation of African states in these institutions. The second topic concerns financial products that could be implemented to improve solvency and liquidity for African states. IMF general allocation offers quasi-monetary money power without conditionality, but their allocation benefits mainly to G7 countries, we know that. International discussions have therefore established options for recycling SDRs to countries that need them most, and other proposals are on the table. First, the recycling of SDR, which is an attempt to correct the mismatch in the general allocation key, but these SDR recycling channels have their limits. The first one access to financing providing by these funds remains subject to the conditionality principle. And second, since these loans are provided to the states at low rates, so-called concessionarity, resources must be found in the form of grants to finance this concessionality. Recycling SDRs by MDBs could be a third way. The SDR-bearing countries will use their SDRs to purchase hybrid capital instruments issued by multilateral development banks. They could thus borrow more on capital market with significant leverage effect. But there are certainly other avenues to explore, including maybe some more radical ones, and I look forward to hearing our panelists discussing about it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Charles, for your presentation and just sort of setting the scene in such a sort of comprehensive and succinct way. I'd now like to invite our panelists on stage. If I can find my notes, excuse me. So yes, we have a very distinguished panel today. First of all, Mr. Bihi Iman EGEH, who is the Minister of Finance from the Federal Republic of Somalia. Monsieur Adama COULIBALY, who is the Minister of Finance and Budget for the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire. Professor Carlos Lopez, who is an honorary professor at the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. And last not least, Dr. Patrick NJOROGE, who is the co-chair of the Debt Relief for Green and Inclusive Recovery, formerly the Governor of the Central Bank of Kenya. Gentlemen, welcome to the stage. Fantastic. And just to an advance word of warning, this session will be there will be discussion in English and in French, so please do have your headsets ready when the time comes. Very good. So Patrick, I'm just wondering, maybe, sorry, you're all the way over there. Hello. I'm just wondering if we can come to you to start off with. This, I mean, Charles kind of laid out the issues there in his presentation. I mean, what really kind of, as we sort of kind of kick off this topic about debt and how to approach it and the sort of the new approaches that can be taken, I mean, what really kind of stands out for you? And I mean, what are the sort of, what stood out for you in Charles' presentation that needs to be emphasized, would you say?
Thank you very much, John, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel. Debt is a big word and a significant item, as the presentation showed, but I think there are like two tracks. First, you have the very short-term issues, and these are countries that relate to countries that are in debt distress or have significant issues and are negotiating with their creditors, and there are several that we can discuss, the recent discussion also with Zambia, Ghana, etc. And then you have the longer-term issues, which are also present today. So in a sense, this is the amount of debt payments that have been made have outstripped the expenditures by government expenditures, let's say on health and education. So for instance, a country like Nigeria, one of the most populous countries in Africa, you find that they are spending more than 2/3 of their revenue on making debt service payments. Whereas on education and health, they're less than 1% of GDP. So there's a crisis that's brewing. Add to that the crisis that, or the concern about climate change and the amounts, the financing that is needed on that. So the point is, the bottom line is we have a problem that we have to deal with today, not just the short-term issues that I mentioned, but actually these other things, long-term issues, if we have to get over to, let's say, a more, let's say, balanced society.
Thank you indeed. Monsieur le Ministre, I'm wondering, could you sort of share your experiences? Vous pouvez partager votre expérience au Côte d'Ivoire.
Can you share the Ivorian experience?
And what needs to change really from your perspective?
Thank you. I'm going to speak in French. I think that the presentation that was made a while ago illustrates the situation on the African continent. Côte d'Ivoire's experience, if I would like to say, is to say that today we find ourselves in a situation where debt can be considered as being well managed relatively. For those that follow the news on Côte d'Ivoire, you can see that about 10 days ago, our department in charge of finance obtained an award on the quality of the management of the debt. But this is being done because there has been an arsenal of measures to manage debt and to actually contain them within optimal limits or manageable limits. And that we find ourselves in a situation with a risk of being over-indebted because, you know, since 2014, Côte d'Ivoire has been on the international financial market to actually raise capital. And to be able to raise capital, the investors should be actually happy with our debt sustainability levels. And today we can tell you that with the important measures that were taken with regards to the liabilities management measures, that was actually to actually raise funds at lower rates to actually refinance debts that had been contracted at costs that were quite high. We've carried out several operations like this that have allowed us to find ourselves in a global debt situation that can be as sustainable and correct as possible. And of course, we are also doing our best to ensure that our debt profile over time, over these days, like I said, we've carried out several bonds on the market, sometimes with long maturity times, or we can get to 10 to 12 years. And sometimes we have the possibility of actually paying back in 1 year the capital. So when we take a look at the list, we can see that there are specific years where we actually find peaks of reinvestment on our debt profile. So what we actually did regards to liabilities management is to refinance these debts to ensure to try and have an appreciable profile. Now, going beyond Côte d'Ivoire, if I would like to give global opinion on debt, I can say that our countries in Africa are actually going through distressing debt levels because over the last few years, especially since COVID 2020 came in, the rhythm of debt has actually gotten worse because a lot of countries no longer had the possibility to actually finance themselves easily. So today, as we are here with our partners, we realize that we should actually address the question of debt. And so, like the first panelist said, not only on the short term, but equally on the long term, because we have needs of investment which are really significant. We also have the duty to improve the quality of life of our populations by actually financing social infrastructure, but also ensuring that the population have the best quality of lives possible. And that is why we are committed to actually work on the social sectors, be it health, education, water, sanitation, and at the same time we should also do important investments to support our growth over time. So this also requires that we actually have borrowing rates that be as low as possible. So I have actually done a lot of advocacy on this, but I'll talk about the cost of financing with the risk linked to the countries. Thank you.
I mean, in terms of that burden, I think, Minister Bihi, I mean, I'd like to come to you now. I mean, just from your perspective, from the other side of the continent, I mean, and Somalia, I mean, which has faced its unique challenges over several years. I mean, can you kind of give your perspective of kind of what sort of you've gone through as we would term a fragile state, and so, I mean, how you've worked through with that debt burden in recent years?
Well, thank you, John. I'm also honored to participate in this important panel discussion with such a distinguished fellow panelists. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the Kingdom of Morocco for their exceptional hospitality. Coming to your question on debt burden, particularly in relation to fragility, as you know, fragility is one of the most intractable development challenges that we are facing today. And just to provide a bit of context, fragile states are hosting close to 1 billion population globally. And according to the World Bank, 60% of the poor will be hosted in fragile states in 2030. So we're talking about significant proportions of population, particularly the most vulnerable population in the world. So Somalia, being one of those fragile states, has endured almost close to 3 decades of state failure that actually stem from almost 2 decades of civil strife that have destroyed government institutions. So we have been grappling with this challenge. And because of the collapse of the state institutions, we have not been able to have, relations with international financial institutions. And then technically we have been in default for the last 30 years. In 2012, we have normalized our relations with the IMF and the World Bank, and we have started with a staff monitoring program. So we embarked on a debt relief journey that was not only aimed at cancellation of debts from Somalia, but also aimed at building state institutions. So for us, debt relief has been a state building process. It has taken almost 10 years. In 2020, we have reached the decision point that has unlocked some finances from IDA, where we have not been able to access IDA resources for the last 30 years. And through the HIBIC process that are aimed at addressing that crisis for poor countries, we have managed to rebuild the state institutions, increase our domestic revenue mobilizations, and also strengthen some strengthen financial institutions. So we've reached the HIBIC completion point a year ago, in December last year, 2023. And that has been a momentous achievement for the nation. But I think, that is a common challenge for all nations. But fragile states with other, burdens, weaker institutions, low domestic revenue, underdeveloped financial institutions or markets, and limited access to international financial markets. So putting these challenges together put us in a very precarious position for fragile states. And then criminalization of the whole economy, because access to these financial markets is very challenging because of the perceived weakness of fragile institutions. So that economic criminalization actually puts those countries in a very precarious position, and I think that has to change. at the moment.
Thank you very much for your perspective, and I think we'll come to the sort of the challenges that you face. I mean, following on, I mean, not only kind of going through the process, but also what happens afterwards as well. The situation. I think, Carlos, I'd like to come to you now. I mean, in Charles' presentation, I mean, there were a number of suggestions which were made there, and then on the financing side, there was talk about, I mean, things like sort of SGR right, SGRs, and sort of the rechanneling of those and sort of the hybrid instruments, and then in addition sort of kind of local currency loans, and then also sort of asset collateralization, as it were, as kind of as potential solutions. I mean, going forward, I mean, I'm just thinking about how do these, I mean, what do you make of these kind of new methods? And I mean, and sort of how do you see from your perspective sort of a better approach emerging going forward?
Well, I want to thank Charles for his presentation because, you know, he has a graph there that demonstrates that things started to get bad from 2010 onwards. And we should ask why. And the answer is very simple. There was 2008, 2009 crisis. The aftershock of that came. And then we had successive shocks that were added. And therefore, the curve that could have made the management of the debt service possible for most African countries started to erode. Is this an African problem? No, it's not an African problem. Every other part of the world experienced the same. So what is it that is peculiar to Africa? What is peculiar to Africa is the difficulty in servicing that debt. That is not very surprising. Not very surprising, first, because it doesn't have access to liquidity. Let's start with. Second, it pays a premium risk for whatever, you know, debt sovereign demands it may have. You know, we are talking about Africans having the obligation to go to the commercial debt because concessional lending has not increased in the same proportion as the GDP increase in the continent. So therefore, in percentage terms, what is available in terms of concessional lending is not commensurate to the needs. So you have to go to the market, you have to pay a higher price than everybody else. So where is the surprise? If you are paying more than anybody else, that you have less access than anybody else, and you have the same problems as everybody else, well, it's very simple. You are going to face a crisis. So we look into what could be the solutions, which is your question. Well, one solution is all the promises on climate finance being fulfilled, because we have 1 trillion deficit of unfulfilled promises so far, and it keeps accumulating. So that is not happening. Second, maybe we have instruments that are going to respond to the crisis, like the ones that the G20 and the Paris Club have put together after the pandemic. Did they work? Well, we just look into which countries first even opted for them. Very few did, because it was unworkable. And if it is a solution that is supposed to drag you for 5, 6 years of negotiations, like we have seen in Zambia, in Ghana, and other countries that risked putting their neck into this solution, well, that's not an option. So we have to ask ourselves, is this an African problem when 99% of the sovereign debt is from other regions than Africa? Africa represents 1%. Have you heard something called too big to fail? Is Africa too big to fail? Because some enterprises were too big to fail and they were rescued. They were rescued. Is Africa with 1% of cost too big to fail, or doesn't count more than some enterprises that were rescued with losses that were much higher than the complete African debt? So that is the question we should ask. And then we start looking into the solutions. The solution of SDR new allocations, yeah, for me it's a Band-Aid. It's not going to really create any structural difference. we have huge knowledge of debt restructuring plans that have not worked properly. You know, the DSSI and Common Framework is just the last. So we go all the way to where we started, different types of restructuring, and we come to the conclusion that maybe the most exceptional for Africa was the EPIC. But the EPIC was very lengthy in terms of the discussion, but it did deliver at the end. It created a very good situation for most African countries. So are we now imitating the EPIC sort of solution? Not even. So we are actually, after all the learning, and for a problem that is more than African, proposing solutions that are less than what we have already experimented. Because this SDR reallocation is less. So that's my answer.
Indeed. And I mean, Patrick, I think sort of coming on to you, I mean, just, sort of building on what Carlos was saying, I mean, in terms of kind of the solutions that are there, but also, I mean, I also want to kind of ask another question alongside. Carlos talked about sort of the alternative revenue kind of generating strategies from countries. And we've seen this so many times coming up in IMF programs, and yes, must kind of work on revenue generating in this, that, and the other. And I think, I mean, we've seen how this has been going in Kenya recently, sort of with the events of earlier on in the year, and in so many other markets as well. I mean, I think my question is, what really is realistic in this in terms of kind of revenue generating? Okay, sure, you can point out the sort of the tax receipts and such, but it seems as if sometimes kind of people are saying, okay, well, you wave your magic tax wand and then everything will be well. So, but what are your thoughts on solutions?
Thank you. Maybe answering the last question first about revenues. It is true most of our countries have low revenue to GDP ratios compared to other jurisdictions. And maybe, yes, there has been also a time when in some countries, Kenya and others, there was a higher revenue to GDP ratios. I was talking about revenue to GDP ratios. So I think it's natural for governments to want to go back to higher levels of revenues, to have greater fiscal space, etc. But I think the issues, whether they are urged by the IMF or not, that's a secondary question. But I think the issue has to be a realistic sort of increase. To sort of expect a country to ramp up revenue to GDP ratios at a time when there is a crisis out there, or for that matter, increasing it by 3 percentage points of GDP in 1 or 2 years or 3 years, I think that's unrealistic. So there has to be realism, and in terms of how the fiscal space is created domestically. And I think there's a lot of experience in that space if we would only look at it. So that's my answer to that. But in terms of the things going forward, in terms of the solutions, I completely associate myself with Carl's approach, the way he's explained it, and indeed the outcomes. At the end of the day, you do need to accept that there has to be a sort of a resource transfer to the countries, to African countries. The issue is it enough to break the banks in, or to break the, let's say, the system, the current arrangements, right, in the global north? And the sense there is no. Carlos has explained it well in terms of how it compares to, let's say, Ukraine. Yeah, Ukraine, just like this, they got $20 billion write-off by the US. I think the numbers that Somalia got was much less than that. But I'm making the point that the issue here is one of political will. Now, it is true it takes time for the political will to be put together, etc. But I think the issue here has to be, if we don't do it now, then when? It won't happen because the cost in terms that will come down years later in terms of delayed development, in terms of the planet, really, etc., and the people are just too huge. So it's today we have to countenance those deals and think of a HIPIC type, obviously HIPIC on steroids, meaning it's one that actually improves on the HIPIC approaches that were there, but there has to be some sort of debt relief. Financing by itself won't solve a problem. Financing by itself is just, and these are the arrangements, the SDRs and all those other things. Those only kick the can down the road.
As Carlos says, it's a Band-Aid, isn't it?
And it's a Band-Aid. So I think we need to have, to really look at the problem and get a proper solution for it.
Indeed. And I mean, Minister Bihi, we've talked about the HIPIC process, that you've just been through and such. I think it's almost a year to the day since it was concluded in Somalia. Can you kind of share your perspective of how the past year since then has gone? Because again, it's not, you finish the HIPIC process and then you live happily ever after. Can you tell us about the sort of the challenge? On the one hand, so there has been that relief, but what have been the challenges for you kind of just rebuilding after, sort of specifically after that process has been concluded?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good question, particularly post-HIPIC dispensation and the challenges that stem from the process. Yes, it's been a year since we have completed the HIPIC process. And, when through the HIPIC process, you are building an expectation that when HIPIC is over, then there will be more financing. There will be change, because through the HIPIC there has been, stricter austerity measures, so that people expected that after HIPIC there will be a life that is better than the HIPIC process. So when HIPIC is over, then practically nothing has changed. Because to reap the benefit of HIPIC is not an overnight. It takes time to gain and to reap the benefits of the debt relief process. So once we have reached the HIPIC process, in fact, we are on the brink of financial cliff, because we have been accessing IDA on grant terms during the HIPIC process. And as you are aware, IDA terms stipulate that grant access is exclusively restricted for countries that are categorized as countries that are in high debt distress. So when you reach HIPIC completion point, your debt sustainability comes to a moderate level, a sustainable level, but your macroeconomic situation has not changed. So I think without increasing or providing exceptionality from the IDA, we would have been in a very difficult situation. But I am very grateful for our partners, particularly the World Bank and the African Development Bank, who have extended our access to IDA and ADF on grant terms. So I think from the HIPIC experience, what is very crucial is that there is a greater need for a grace period for countries who are actually emerging from debt distress and who have addressed debt on debt relief process to continue to access concessional resources on grant terms. So that is actually very important. Without that, it's very difficult for countries to actually stay on track and also maintain the reform momentum and embed the reform gains that has been achieved through the process.
Indeed. I was speaking with a gentleman earlier about. It's not it's an imperfect analogy, particularly with regards to Somalia. But in terms of kind of debt as a prison, when you get out of prison, it's not you're out of prison, you've done your time, and then you get on with your life, without the support and without sort of something to help sustain you and carry you through. there's the great risk that you'll kind of get into more problems in due course. So that's, I mean, as you say, the the access to grants is still important. So yeah, so I think, Monsieur le Ministre, I think what I'd like to come to you now, because Côte d'Ivoire, I mean, you talked about the financing that you accessed earlier on in the year, and then also in the last week or so, there's been a new deal. I mean, and you also talked about paying it off and about trying to minimize the debt payments, as it were. But then in the last week, there's been a very interesting development with the World Bank on a debt for development swap. I'm wondering if you can tell us about your experience with that, how this came about, and also whether such a tool might be of use for other African countries as well.
Okay.
So with regard to this question, this is a new initiative that was launched by the World Bank. And as my colleagues said, we need to find solutions to the sovereign debts in general. So the World Bank has initiated a new plan. Côte d'Ivoire was the flagship country to get on board of this initiative. And this process has followed the eligibility processes, following the World Bank programs, in order to find programs that are less costly in the capital market, and also the possibility to refinance the credits that were granted at high interest rates. So this the saving that will be generated will be injected in projects that are of a social character. In Côte d'Ivoire, the education sector was selected for fundings that will be based on those transactions. This is a plan, among others, that we will test. But so for us in Côte d'Ivoire, this would be a solution. This won't be the solution to everything, but it will be one of the solutions to the debt problem. So as a flagship country, the other countries will follow based on the results that we will make, and they will work on their eligibility to get on board of this initiative. So I would like to go back to another point. So many initiatives have been taken. So like the special selection process. So the funds that were mobilized were $650 billion for countries who have advantages and who are in fact not needy of such fundings. So this has given us a 5% of the world population that will benefit from a very high amount of money. So at the end of the day, those who have benefited are not those who are really in need of those funds, and this is a real problem. The other thing is, those funds were put in place within the shared framework, which has two objectives. One is to manage the debt problem, and also to manage the repayment of the debt at a certain time limit. And the third point is to solve the cash flow problem of the countries. Normally, the resources should have been used for two things. First, to increase the share of the PRGT, which is aim to reduce poverty and to boost growth and to boost the multilateral banks of development. So the African Bank of Development was at the front rows of advocating for bringing in resources to support African countries, but it's been a few years now that we can find that we need to have an increase of the scorings and in order to benefit from this. But we have a lot of detail on this level, but we have realized that we can have more impact with the leverage effect that has been given by the African Bank for Development. Those initiatives take time to be implemented fully, and this is a real problem, because we need a way to speed up the processes. So when we speak about all these questions and those problems of COVID and all those things, but after that, with the Ukraine crisis, we had the rise of the raw materials and the energy prices, and we are now in a context where the climate problem is becoming more significant, and we have to take it into consideration in all our plannings. So in addition to this, we have the risk subsidies, which are really very high and which do not correspond to the real situation of the various countries. So those subsidies are to be paid in higher rates compared to other places, knowing that the risk is not that high in Africa compared to other countries. So these questions need to be taken into consideration if for Africa to have a financing cost that can be accepted and in order to finance those development projects.
Indeed, Minister. We have around about 10 minutes left. I mean, I think the risk premium needs to be talked about, and I mean, it's high on everybody's agenda. I'd like to just ask initially, are there any questions from the audience that anybody would like to ask at this point? You'll have an opportunity right towards the end if you want. If you want to raise your hand now or wait a little bit. I'm not seeing any hands at this exact moment, but I mean, this is your sort of 10-minute warning to kind of come up with some questions for our panel. Talking about the risk premium, the prejudice premium that is there have been many different arguments kind of mooted sort of by people from the continent, from outside the continent. I mean, Carlos, I mean, can you tell us about, do you see that, is the prejudice premium a real thing for you? And I mean, would the African Union's kind of proposal for a new African credit agency solve this?
Well, I have my doubts about the African Union project, not because of the intention, but because of the prohibitive costs of putting together a rating agency. You know, you're talking about $100 million that you will require to really launch a proper mechanism that will be credible. And this is not going to be easy to mobilize, first. Second, you will have always this political dimension associated to it that is going to put a lot of investors on notice, and they will not be necessarily very keen. So maybe what we need to learn is what happened in China and more recent examples of transformation. You know, China, for once, didn't have really a capital markets like we know today until 1990. So it's not long ago. And what happened is that, you know, in a very short period of time, they were able to mobilize substantial amounts of domestic resources, not necessarily by changing completely at the beginning the fiscal pressure elements, but rather by making sure that through regulations they were obliging their institutional funds to put money into capital markets that were more controlled by the country. We could even extend that to foreign reserves. So what happened is that we have about $1 trillion of funds in our pension funds and other institutional funds. It would be really completely different if they were used productively, first, and second, that they were used with a bit more of a nationalistic approach, which would be completely understandable because that's the game that everybody plays. And then we'll diminish the price for certain types of innovative mechanisms that can be put in place. A second element that I think is critical is for us to try to localize debt in local currency as much as possible. And here is where multilateral development institutions should play a role. Some of these SDR, new allocations and so on will have a completely different effect if we go the route that the ADB suggested. But I would say even more if they allow for certain types of localization of the sovereign debt, because that will basically protect from the currency volatility. It will even protect the currencies themselves and will contribute to a large extent to have a more manageable situation. We have the experience of West African Central Bank that could be a good example of how this can be done, because a lot of the WEMOA debt is becoming more and more localized. And I think that's obviously contributing to a bit more of a cushioning. Now, on the rating agencies themselves, I think we have really to discipline them. And I say this with non-ideological sort of interpretation. What I mean is that there are certain things that are practiced by the rating agencies that don't make any sense from an economic point of view. One of them is to consider that every single activity, project, initiative in a given jurisdiction in Africa has to have the same rating as the sovereign rating. This is completely absurd. This is not what is practiced elsewhere. And this is something that we have to challenge. Second, we have to go into the criteria that is not based on metrics. And we have plenty. There are a lot of political criteria that is part of the evaluation and assessment that is subject to interpretations that are a bit distant from reality. And we know this because if you have the trajectory of Africa's growth that is now at the same level as Asia, and this is not me saying, it's the economic outlook of the IMF saying, if that is the case, how can you explain that the majority of the continent, we are talking about almost all countries except one, are in the speculative categories of the rating agencies? So how can you explain that? This is the second fastest growing region in the world, and in fact now is catching up in the first. And the trajectory is that probably it's going to surpass it in percentage terms. So this is not justifiable. So if you start lining up these different elements, you have to have a serious discussion about how to regulate the interpretations that are provoking a risk premium for Africa that is not necessarily based on metrics that make sense. And this is not ideological. This is just a technical discussion that has to take place by comparing A to B, by comparing, Burkina Faso with Georgia, by comparing, Senegal with Greece, and then we'll see that a lot of things that are applied to other jurisdictions are completely different when it comes to Africa.
Indeed. I like the idea of non-ideological disciplining. So if there are any representatives in the thing. There's a question, Iman, just towards the back. Just at the back there.
Right, thank you so much. My name is Mahmoud Muhiddin. I'm a Special Envoy of the Secretary General of the UN on financing sustainable development, friend of all of the panelists, and not just of the Friendship I commend what they said and, of course, the introductory remarks. Three things of political economy nature, which have been touched upon in different ways by the panelists, and why we are, despite the kind of serious discussion that we have today, we don't see matters related to debt positioned in the top 10 risks for those who are anticipating risks for 2025. If you go and browse many of these reports that just came out during the last couple of weeks, at best it comes as number 9 or 10, but not with the seriousness that the panelists have said. It's basically a confirmation of what the World Bank colleagues described the problem as silent debt crisis. And it's basically for two things: that the creditors are different, and that's why the HIPC initiative of the old type will not work, because it's not just the political leadership, the dynamics and the incentive that would work, where Paris Club was more than 50% of the credit would not work, while the Paris Club is less than 10% today. It's as simple as that. Creditors are different, including emerging markets, including private sector. This is one thing. So it seems that in some elements, we are fighting the old war. The second one is basically the fear and concern by many indebted countries not to disclose their position and their willingness, I wouldn't say even restructuring, do some serious management of their debt, not to antagonize, as mentioned by Carlos in the context of the rating agencies, then to downgrade them or to change their outlook. So we have now, both of the players are claiming, no, we have no problem. But as mentioned earlier, I think when you have countries spending more than 70% of their revenue on debt service, this is basically, they are not defaulting in debt by defaulting almost in everything else, including the SDGs and education. That requires the political leadership, and the opportunity will come on the finance for development in Spain next year, where the developing countries, not just the heavily indebted or the seriously indebted, but those who could really face problems in the future, to join a club of collaboration to unite their voice. The second one, very quickly.
Very quickly, please. Yeah.
Okay, on the rating agencies, some agencies or institutions were brave more than others, but basically because they don't have papers rated. You have seen the criticism, constructive, non-ideological, by the IMF to the rating agencies because they're flawed methodologies when it comes to sustainable finance and long-term investments, when it comes to green transformation. It's published in their outlook. But we need really to do more, especially with entities that are not in fear of downgrade. And there will be opportunities to discuss that further. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Would anybody like to come back to that? Patrick?
Thank you. Thank you. Maybe quick, rapid fire on this. Thank you about the issue of discussing, bringing the issue of debt to the table. Maybe it's true that for many countries, meaning the creditors countries and the global north, debt is not so high up. However, actually, for the countries that matter, it is very high up. South Africa, for instance, the president just launched the South African presidency of the G20. And the second priority is debt. So it is coming up. The numbers are there. You cannot avoid the math, let's put it that way. We can look the other way, but the reality is there. And it's true, there's little political appetite. Absolutely. But then again, as somebody said, Nelson Mandela said this, it always seems impossible until it is done. So we have to have that courage to change the entire enterprise. Now, it's true, there is, you have the Financing for Development 4 that's coming up. That is one locus, one venue, one forum where this needs to be on the table. But I really think all other forums need to pick them up, need to pick up the issue of debt. Finally, it is important to note that it's easy to point a finger to, so-and-so is not doing their work. You mentioned the issue of the IMF pointing a finger at the credit rating agencies. By the way, I completely concur with Carlos on this issue of credit. What is the approach? But anyway, credit rating. But I was going to say that the IMF has its own problems. We have been quite critical about the DSAs, the way they do the debt sustainability analysis, but they've been very slow in moving on that. So I think everybody has mud on their face, and everybody needs to come to the table and actually work together. We need a collective solution. This is a time for a collective solution. It's not a time for us to go in different ways. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to just finally come make any points based on what the gentleman said, or Monsieur le Ministre?
Juste un point.
Just one point or a reaction to the question regarding risks, and I have also a suggestion. I believe that in terms of risk, there is no doubt about it. There is a bias that needs to be corrected, but because when we look at the risk scale, it's from 1 to 7, and when you look at all the African countries, they are rated between 7 and 6 at the highest rate. This is a systematic rating. So what is the bias that makes what is the means that can help all the countries to be rated properly and to correct the situation between countries? This is the first element. And so we need to see what is the institution that can make these changes, or we can also work on the excellence centers in Africa. And now it is time to pose this question about this risk rating. Also, I think that there are many discussions that put the ball into the camp of our partners without looking at our role and what we have to do. So we have to mobilize our domestic resources. So if we have enough resources internally, we won't be needing debts. So how can we mobilize more resources at the local level? This is what will enable us to invest in health and in other sectors. These resources need to be available, and it is this is the subject that we need to think about, and I believe that by working together we can find solutions to the resources that we can control.
Sorry.
It's just to build on what the minister said in terms of domestic resource mobilization. You cannot increase your revenue collection if you don't do structural transformation of the economies. And structural transformation requires formalizing transactions, right? So if you look into the sort of the glorifying of the informal sector by some development agents, we are really in trouble. Because, this is a discourse that really goes against the need for structural transformation. So what is the reality in Africa? The reality is that only 17 countries out of 54 have their national accounts up to date, meaning utilizing the methodological requirements at year base not being longer than 5 and so on. Only 17. Then you have 40% of the African population without civil registration. And then you have only 10% of the registerable land in Africa that is properly registered. So you don't know your economy enough, you don't know your population enough, you don't know your territory enough. This is a recipe for informality. And this is something that we really have to tackle. Now, what is the part of responsibility of the IMF? In Article 4 consultations, you have to disclose, sort of the status of the economy, all sorts of data sets. One of them is national accounts. So the IMF knows that all these countries don't have national accounts up to date, year after year, Article 4 consultation after Article 4 consultation. And what is done about it? Very little, because this has been going on for 2-3 decades. So this is part of the problem. Should be a priority, because that is the way you can actually increase revenue collection.
Indeed. Minister Bihi, yes, briefly.
Okay, just a quick I think on the credit rating agencies, enough has been said, but I just want to mention that during the COVID-19, at the onset of the COVID-19, the debt suspension, debt servicing suspension initiative has been initiated, and a number of countries has actually not benefited from that because out of fear of downgrading their credit rating. So that actually indicates how, the implications of these credit rating agencies on the continent. So I think something has to change. It's imperative that these credit rating agencies limit their unsolicited credit ratings in Africa. And I think the question on local knowledge is also very pertinent in these discussions. Very often these credit rating agencies are based in the West. They have a very little footprint in Africa. And these desk-based assessments, and apart from these quantitative assessments, the socio-political analysis is also important to have a local knowledge, and it requires some nuanced contextual understandings on African economies. So I think it's very important that we held these critical continent held these credit rating agencies to account, and some sort of regulation is required. So regarding on the question on revenue, I think broadening the tax base is very important, and without growing the economy, as Carlos said, it is actually, there is a very little chance to enhance the revenue mobilization activities. But what I have seen practically is that automation and modernization of revenue sources has very positive implications on revenue growth. So we have seen an exponential growth on the sources that has been automated. This has also increased transparency around revenue collection and also some sort of confidence, particularly in fragile states where the social contract is weak or broken. It's very important, this governance and transparency aspects of revenue mobilization is very important. So that is very important. And in terms of the realisticness of mobilization, I think modest approaches are required in order not to endanger economic growth, as well as also not to undermine the already weak social contract. So thank you.
Thank you. There's so much more that we can discuss about this issue and so many others, but unfortunately our time is up. Gentlemen, Minister Bihi, Monsieur le Ministre, Carlos, Patrick, thank you so very much for a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much for listening, everybody.